This was the moment when US forces descended from helicopters and seized this Venezuelan tanker. At this point, US-Venezuela relations touched their lowest point. But Maduro seemed to have an answer for this. He had a hope, not because his army could stand up to the US, but because he believed secret forces in the shadows wouldn't let him fall. On October 26, 2025, a mysterious Ilyushin IL-76 transport aircraft arrived in Caracas. 2 days later, the aircraft flew from there to Cuba and Nicaragua. Then it returned back to Venezuela. And on October 30th, it departed on its journey back to the country it came from. This was mysterious because the purpose of this mission was unknown. But when experts dug into history, they noticed a similar pattern. The fleet of aircraft also served to supply military expeditions to the global south, especially Africa. But this time its destination was Latin America, and the timing seemed perfect. Around the same time, Maduro claimed on a television program that Venezuela possesses 5,000 anti-aircraft missiles that originated from that same country. This wasn't just a statement, it was a warning to the US. The US seemed to ignore these facts and still chose to teach a lesson to Venezuela. Was it a miscalculation or a perfectly timed masterstroke? Soon, both sides realized what it really was. Out of all the countries in the world, Venezuela stands out for two main reasons. The first one is, well, it's pretty obvious, the resource the world cannot function without. It possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, estimated at about 303 billion barrels as of 2023. So this should have made it one of the wealthiest nations in the world. But the reality is completely shocking. The country has fallen deep into poverty, and more than 51% of its population is living in extreme hardship. The reason? Well, years of systemic corruption, economic mismanagement, and institutional collapse. But who cares? It still had the oil the world wanted. This is why many countries wanted Venezuela by their side. But a few of them seem to be too nice. The world called these countries the Crink coalition: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, Crink. And this coalition made Nicolas Maduro more rigid and ruthless in nature. It enabled not just corruption, but systematic oppression of the Venezuelan people. But this didn't bother these countries, because both their goals were being met: securing oil supplies, and the other was keeping America in check. It sounds pretty crazy, but this is what it was. As the energy needs started growing in the world, oil demands surged, and Venezuela started becoming more important for the world. So logically, Venezuela's oil exports should have soared many folds. But reality tells a completely different story. In 1998, prior to Hugo Chávez's rise to power, the country produced roughly 3.4 million barrels of oil per day. By the time Chávez died and Nicolas Maduro assumed the presidency in 2013, production had already fallen to about 2.7 million barrels per day. After 2019, Venezuela's oil output collapsed to around 1 million barrels per day. It seemed really weird for a country that lost an opportunity to become one of the wealthiest countries in the world selling oil. But on the ground, reality says it was really destined for this. Economic mismanagement and corruption looks like the obvious reason, but deep down, the reality was something else. In the beginning, internal factors like mismanagement caused the decline. This decline turned Venezuela into a hub for powerful criminal networks and drug trafficking organizations such as Tren de Aragua, Tren de Llano, and the Cartel of the Suns, making daily life increasingly unsafe for ordinary citizens. But then Nicolas Maduro assumed the presidency in 2013. Did things change? Yes, they did. The only problem was these changes he brought made Venezuela hell. Living conditions worsened significantly, and he is widely described as an authoritarian leader. He has even been accused of corruption and links to these drug cartels. Because of poor governance and corruption, nearly 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2014. And that's not a mistake. That's more than the population of many countries. About 85% resettle in other Latin American nations, including at least 3 million in Colombia alone. Armed groups operating across the porous Colombia-Venezuela border have further endangered migrants, intensifying insecurity and contributing to a regional humanitarian crisis that has strained neighboring countries' ability to provide housing, healthcare, and employment. Because of the Venezuela crisis, drug trafficking and underworld crime networks have flourished, not only in Latin America, but also in the Caribbean and North America. On multiple occasions, the United States has attempted to curb Venezuela's drug trafficking networks and systemic corruption through sanctions, particularly after 2018. Sanctions. Remember this word for now because this is what has made Venezuela a battleground for the superpowers. America's measures went beyond targeting Venezuela's oil sector and extended to foreign companies that continue doing business with Caracas. And that signaled Washington's intent to isolate the Maduro regime economically and diplomatically. But it's been more than a decade, and Maduro has his supremacy intact. All because his godfathers, the Crink coalition, didn't want him to fail. Oil was the obvious reason, the world thought, until it noticed the bigger moves that proved it wrong. Maduro's allies provided more than diplomatic backing and kept Venezuela functioning when sanctions cut it off from global markets. So Russia acted as a middleman to offset the collapse of Venezuela's oil production and to sell its crude on international markets. Since 2001, the two countries have institutionalized their energy partnership, focusing heavily on heavy crude projects in the Orinoco Belt. Russian state companies hold direct investments in 3 Venezuelan joint ventures that produce about 107,000 barrels of crude per day. And this is roughly 11% of Venezuela's current output and generates approximately $67 million a month, according to Francisco Manaldi, director of the Latin American Energy Program at Rice University. Russia also controls valuable exploration and export rights to Venezuela's Patao and Mejillones offshore gas fields, and its rights to proved but untapped Venezuelan crude reserves could be worth up to $5 billion. But then came the second largest pillar to support Maduro. Beijing has emerged as Venezuela's main creditor and its largest oil buyer, often routing shipments through third parties to bypass U.S. sanctions. Its financing arrangement with China operates through 2 major mechanisms. The first one is a long-term $20 billion fund, and the second one is the so-called Chinese fund, which began at $4 billion and has grown to about $5 billion. It's a pretty insane amount of money, right? Except they're regretting it now. A recent study by a team of Venezuelan economists led by Ricardo Hausmann sheds light on the scale of Venezuela's financial crisis. According to the report, Venezuela's total external debt stands at approximately $160 billion US dollars. Out of that, at least $25.5 billion is owed directly to China. This debt appears on the balance sheets of Bandes, the Venezuelan development bank created under Hugo Chavez. Servicing this Chinese debt alone costs Venezuela between $5.5 and $6 billion every year, a massive burden for an economy already on the brink. And remember, this figure only includes government-to-government agreements. It does not account for private debts held by Chinese or joint Chinese-Venezuelan companies. Financing everything was fine, but in 2018, the unexpected happened. In December of 2018, Russia made this commitment clear by dispatching long-range strategic bombers to Venezuela in a high-profile show of support. Soon after, Moscow and Caracas signed multiple military technical cooperation agreements, and Venezuela even proposed granting Russia access to La Ochila Island military base, just miles from U.S. shores. In 2019, Russian transport aircraft landed in Caracas carrying 35 tons of military and technical supplies. Between 2005 and 2013, Russian arms exports to Venezuela surged to roughly $11 billion, including Su-30Mk fighter jets, Mi-35 and Mi-17 helicopters, tanks, self-propelled artillery, and advanced air defense systems such as the S-300VM. This was not symbolic support, but a full-scale military partnership. Russia was doing its best to help its dear friend. Oh, come on, let's talk about reality. Because in geopolitics, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. In this case, Russia was eyeing the second superpower Venezuela had. From Moscow's perspective, this relationship followed a dual strategy. Venezuela provided Russia with a rare forward position in the Western Hemisphere as a counterweight to U.S. military dominance. In 2025, a letter proved that. According to an October 2025 report by The Washington Post, documents show that Nicolas Maduro wrote to President Vladimir Putin requesting assistance to strengthen Venezuela's air defenses. The letter asked for the restoration of previously purchased Sukhoi Su-30Mk2 fighter jets, overhauls of 8 engines and 5 radar systems in Russia, the acquisition of 14 sets of missiles believed to be Russian-made, and additional logistical support. Maduro emphasized that the Sukhoi fighter jets represented the most important deterrent Venezuela possessed in the face of a potential war threat. He also requested a 3-year medium-term financing plan through Rostec, Russia's state defense conglomerate, though no amount was specified. The letter was reportedly carried to Moscow by Venezuela's transportation minister, and a second letter was to be delivered to Russian Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov. It remains unclear whether the Kremlin received or responded to these requests, as neither side has confirmed any concrete new assistance, at least not officially. Because unofficially, the mystery plane from earlier in the video says something else. Soon after reports of Maduro's letter surfaced, the largest Russian Il-76 transport aircraft arrived in Caracas in late October, after flying a circuitous route with several stops, though what it carried was never publicly disclosed. Around the same time, Maduro claimed on a television program that Venezuela possesses 5,000 Russian-made anti-aircraft missiles. These are Ilga-S missiles, short-range, low-altitude systems comparable to the U.S. Stingers. They are capable of targeting drones, cruise missiles, helicopters, and low-flying aircraft, though serious questions remain about their quality, maintenance, and real-world performance. Russian sources also suggested the aircraft may have delivered more advanced air defense systems, such as the Pantsir S-1, a move that would align with Moscow's rushed ratification of a new strategic partnership agreement with Venezuela that includes provisions for expanded military technical cooperation. Historically, Russia has used symbolic shows of support, such as deploying nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018, docking naval vessels in 2024, and acknowledging a limited military presence during the 2019 crisis. More recently, Ukraine's military intelligence reported that a Russian general now oversees a rotational mission in Venezuela, with about 120 personnel training Venezuelan forces in areas ranging from infantry and drones to artillery and intelligence support. With all of these, would the US still choose to target Venezuela? That would be foolish. Well, that's what everyone thought. The US always had its eyes on Venezuela. The only thing it had to do was to make sure that Venezuela's allies wouldn't interfere when it was attacked. Now, there are two ways. The first was using brute force, and the second was a perfect timing. America chooses the smarter option, the timing. And you don't have to look at the American experts to confirm this. Russian experts are enough. Russian officials and analysts have emphasized limits, with one analyst noting bluntly that Russia will not go to war for Venezuela, because analysts widely agree Russia is neither capable nor genuinely interested in providing large-scale military backing. Today, Moscow's resources are far more stretched than in 2019, due to its war in Ukraine and heavy Western sanctions. And distance alone makes meaningful intervention difficult. As one senior analyst told the media, if the United States were serious about regime change by force in Venezuela, Russia would be unlikely to help in any real effective way. Venezuela's other major ally, Beijing, is wrestling with a slowing economy and is cautious about any move that could trigger secondary sanctions or derail sensitive negotiations with Washington. US-led financial measures against Caracas make any large-scale Chinese support costly and complicated, especially at a time when China itself wants to cool tariff tensions. This is why, after meeting President Trump in South Korea, Xi Jinping invited Donald Trump to visit China in April of 2026. In fact, China is now trying to cash in on Venezuela's deteriorating position by demanding even deeper discounts on Venezuelan oil, hardly the behavior of a reliable ally. There are no exact figures, as the Venezuelan government has not published official data for 7 years, but most analysts believe oil accounts for more than 80% of the country's exports, with some estimates placing it above 90%. Most of that oil flows into the black market, with a majority ending up at independent refiners in China. Chinese state-owned enterprises generally avoid these purchases to stay clear of sanctions, but Beijing often turns a blind eye to shipments heading to non-state entities, especially when tankers conceal their true identities so it does not appear that the oil originated in Venezuela. Roughly 80% of Venezuelan oil reaches China through these channels. Around 17% goes to the United States via a license granted by the US Treasury to Chevron, while about 3% is sent to Cuba, largely under subsidized terms. Venezuela has also traditionally required partial upfront payment for oil cargoes. But few buyers are now willing to accept that risk, because a single tanker carrying 2 million barrels, even at today's steep discounts, can be worth around $100 million, a sum few are willing to risk in the event of a US seizure. As a result, buyers increasingly expect Venezuela itself to absorb more of the risk. The bottom line for Maduro is that the only way to sell Venezuelan oil under the current conditions is to offer deeper discounts with fewer prepayment requirements. Export volumes are also likely to suffer, which could force production cuts that are expensive and difficult to reverse. All of this further chokes the already limited revenue Maduro relies on to keep the state functioning. Rising export volumes reflect its state-owned company, PDVSA's, desperation to prevent a total collapse in oil income. But low global crude prices and US sanctions have hit Venezuela's heavy grades especially hard. China, Venezuela's top Asian buyer, is already flooded with heavily discounted Russian and Iranian crude, sharply reducing Caracas's negotiating power. To keep shipments moving, traders say PDVSA has been forced to slash prices, with discounts to Brent now roughly double what they were a year ago. PDVSA does not have much negotiating power, one trader said, noting that shippers demand higher compensation because of the risks of loading near Venezuelan ports, where the US military vessels are anchored. As Vladimir Ruvinsky told the Wall Street Journal, Russia isn't going to help Maduro beyond what they've already done. According to Reuters, after sanctions were imposed, Venezuelan oil shipments were rerouted through the Swiss-based trading arm of Russia's oil giant Rosneft. Ship-to-ship transfers were used to conceal the crude's Venezuelan origin before it ultimately reached Chinese ports. Between July and December of 2020 alone, Reuters found that 18 tankers delivered nearly 19.7 million barrels of rebranded Venezuelan crude to China. Russia state energy giant Rosneft became central to this effort, forming multiple joint ventures with PDVSA across oil and gas fields. Notably, Rosneft capped its ownership at 40% in most projects, a move Moscow framed as respect for Venezuela's oil sovereignty and a partnership rather than dominance, even as Russian influence deepened. In recent weeks, Chinese buyers showed little interest in Venezuela's flagship Murray crude, even at discounts of $14 per barrel below Brent, while another cargo for early 2026 delivery reportedly sold at $15 below Brent. By comparison, late last year, discounts ranged between $5 and $8 per barrel. Rather than helping Venezuela, this dynamic is steadily closing Maduro's long-term survival options. But Venezuelan crude, sanctioned by the US, directly competes with Russia's own oil industry, which is also under US sanctions, and therefore targets many of the same buyers, particularly China. And this is bad news for Venezuela. This pattern mirrors their response during Iran's recent 12-day war with Israel, when Moscow and Beijing provided diplomatic cover but stayed on the sidelines, even after US strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Crucially, both China and Russia are prioritizing major diplomatic and trade deals with Trump, leaving them little incentive to expend political capital on a showdown over Venezuela. So, abandoned by its allies and under crushing US pressure, Venezuela finally saw a ray of hope: the Shadow Fleet. These vessels conceal their identities by using false flags and names. Often, tankers close to retirement are repainted, re-registered, and fitted with manipulated transponders so their locations appear falsified. These ships load oil in Venezuela and then sail onward, sometimes transferring cargo to other vessels at sea, a practice that carries serious environmental risks. The oil typically ends up in Malaysia, where it is rebranded under a Malaysian identity before being shipped onward to China. This shadow network has been central to sustaining Venezuela's black economy and, by extension, Maduro's survival. In recent months, US forces have moved to disrupt this system directly. In November of 2025, a Russian tanker named Seahorse, part of the sanctioned Shadow Fleet, turned back on its way to Venezuela after a US warship blocked its route. According to ship tracking data collected by Bloomberg, on November 13, 2025, the tanker was carrying fuel to Venezuela when the USS Stockdale destroyer intercepted it. The Russian vessel then changed course and headed towards Cuba, while the US warship sailed near Venezuelan territorial waters towards Puerto Rico. Since then, the Seahorse has twice attempted to approach Venezuela but turned back both times, remaining in the Caribbean Sea. After these new US measures, China National Petroleum Corporation, one of PDVSA's top buyers even after earlier sanctions, abruptly canceled Venezuelan oil loadings. The Trump administration has begun targeting not only Venezuelan entities, but also foreign companies doing business with PDVSA, threatening to seize any assets they held inside the United States. The December 2025 operation, in which American forces descended from helicopters onto a tanker, followed months of US military buildup in the Caribbean, and was immediately condemned by the Venezuelan government as barefaced robbery and an act of international piracy. But the Trump administration's aim goes beyond a single seizure. According to Rice University energy expert Francisco J. Manaldi, the tanker, reportedly a 20-year-old supertanker named Skipper, capable of carrying nearly 2 million barrels of oil, was likely bound not for Cuba, as Washington claimed, but ultimately for China, since vessels of that size are rarely used for short Caribbean routes. The ship had already been sanctioned by the US Treasury in 2022 for carrying prohibited Iranian oil and was previously linked to a Russian oil smuggling network. Venezuelan officials argued the seizure is unprecedented, and in many ways they are correct. While Iranian tankers have been seized before, this marked the first time a vessel departing Venezuela with a Venezuelan crew was taken. The White House has signaled it intends to seize not just the cargo, but the ship itself, representing a major financial loss for the owning company. Although the loss technically falls on the buyer, under a free on-board contract, the broader impact is clear. This move represents a sharp escalation in US pressure, with Reuters reporting that around 30 other tankers near Venezuela, part of a shadow fleet moving oil from Venezuela, Russia, and Iran, are also under sanctions. All this buildup in the Caribbean began in August of 2025, when the White House took a dramatic and unprecedented step by doubling the reward for information leading to the arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to $50 million, accusing him of being one of the largest narco-traffickers in the world. US President Donald Trump, a longtime critic of Maduro, made the move after returning to office in January, following Venezuela's election widely condemned for vote rigging and rejected by much of the international community. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the United States was increasing the previously announced $25 million reward, alleging that Maduro was directly involved in major drug smuggling operations. At the same time, U.S. officials confirmed the deployment of air and naval forces to the region, including a nuclear-powered submarine and surveillance aircraft, signaling a sharp escalation in pressure alongside the military buildup. It has since expanded to include aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, and amphibious assault ships capable of landing thousands of troops. U.S. forces insist the focus is not only on oil but also on drug cartels operating illegal maritime routes. Analysis of satellite imagery and ship tracking data has identified at least 9 U.S. military vessels operating in the region in recent weeks. The largest is the USS General R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, spotted near a port in the U.S. Virgin Islands on December 4th, roughly 600 miles from Venezuela, after earlier operating just 125 miles south of Puerto Rico in mid-November. Media reports also identified 8 additional U.S. vessels, including the Special Operations ship MV Ocean Trader and USS Antonio-class amphibious vessels. The closest ship to Venezuela was a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, observed just 15 miles off the Venezuelan coast. Satellite imagery confirms sustained U.S. naval activity over the past 2 weeks as tensions escalate. This buildup follows a series of U.S. airstrikes against alleged drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, which the Trump administration says are necessary to disrupt trafficking networks. Since early September, U.S. forces have conducted at least 22 strikes in international waters, with officials reporting 4 deaths in the latest strike on December 4th, 2025, intensifying speculation about possible military action against Venezuela. The key reason is that the United States has begun taking more serious and coordinated action, gradually weakening Venezuela's links with Russia, China, and Iran. It is clear that Venezuela alone cannot fight the United States, as it lacks both comparable military strength and advanced technology. According to the IISS, the Venezuela Armed Forces, the FANB, have around 123,000 active personnel, around 63,000 in the Army, 25,500 in the Navy, 11,500 in the Air Force, 23,000 in the National Guard, supplemented by roughly 8,000 reservists. In addition, the government can mobilize the Bolivarian militia, a civilian reserve force created under Hugo Chavez. Almost all of Venezuela's military hardware is sourced from Russia, Iran, or China. This was back when they were all actively supporting Venezuela, but, times have changed. At a time when Venezuela's biggest allies were doing little to meaningfully support Maduro, the United States escalated pressure by tightening restrictions around the country. Washington effectively moved to close Venezuelan airspace after the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration warned airlines of potentially hazardous situations due to worsening security conditions and heightened military activity. As a result, 6 major airlines that account for much of South American travel suspended flights to Venezuela. Caracas reacted angrily, revoking the airline's operating rights and accusing them of joining the actions of state terrorism promoted by the United States. With air traffic restricted and repeated U.S. strikes on Venezuelan-linked ships and boats, Venezuela slid deeper into isolation, making maritime and aerial operations easier for the United States to control. This isolation also delivered a severe blow to Venezuela's last remaining hope: Russian tourism. Groups of Russian holidaymakers were rerouted from Venezuelan Caribbean resorts to Cuba, after the U.S. military buildup raised concerns over Venezuelan airspace safety. Some tourists already in Venezuela were told that they would be evacuated at the end of their vacations on special flights. The biggest blow for Maduro came when the United States officially designated the Cartel de los Soles, an organization it says is directly linked to him, as a terrorist organization. This term, the Cartel of the Suns, has been used since the 1990s to describe senior Venezuelan military officers accused of enriching themselves through drug trafficking. Escalating economic pressure, the U.S. Treasury imposed new sanctions, targeting members of Maduro's family and the maritime networks facilitating Venezuela's oil exports. Washington announced sanctions on 3 nephews by the marriage of Nicolas Maduro, along with 6 Venezuelan-flagged oil tankers and shipping companies linked to them, further tightening the noose around the regime. These measures bar sanctioned individuals from accessing any property or financial assets held in the United States, including bank accounts, real estate, or funds that pass through the U.S. financial system. Any U.S. companies or citizens doing business with sanctioned individuals or entities risks penalties and enforcement action. The sanctions also extend to any company owned 50% or more, directly or indirectly, by blocked individuals, even if those firms are not explicitly named. Alongside the so-called narco-nephews, Frankie Flores, Carlos Flores, and Efrain Campo, the U.S. also sanctioned Panamanian businessman Ramon Carretero, who is engaged in petroleum shipments and business dealings with Maduro. And currently, Chevron remains the only U.S. oil producer active in Venezuela, operating under a special license granted first in 2022 and later extended by the Trump administration. Partnering with PDVSA, Chevron accounts for roughly 1/5 of Venezuela's official oil production, and increased shipments from about 128,000 barrels per day in October to roughly 150,000 barrels per day in the following month, as it seeks to recover billions of dollars owed by PDVSA in unpaid bills and past property seizures. Meanwhile, after deploying an aircraft carrier to the Caribbean and carrying out a series of deadly strikes on drug cartels, Trump has also warned that Venezuelan drug trafficking by land could soon be targeted. While the White House frames these actions as necessary to stem the flow of illegal drugs into the United States, many political observers believe the broader objective is to force Nicolas Maduro out of power, and this has created a major debate among analysts over whether Maduro will ultimately be compelled to surrender power or attempt to confront the United States, despite lacking meaningful military backing from Russia and China.